Ladies and gentlemen, never anticipate what a speaker is going to say. You may not like it. Thank you for inviting me here today. Genocide denial necessitates a double death. First, the victim is killed, then the victim's death is denied, and thus the victim is killed a second time. You've lived for decades under the shadow of this double death. As an old Armenian friend of mine once asked me when trying to explain the failure of the world to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, Robert, didn't the Turks kill enough of our grandfathers for us to qualify? I have to say at once that my own newspaper, The Independent of London, goes further than the Armenians have ever asked. We refer to the Armenian genocide as the Armenian Holocaust, with a capital H, by the way, just as we refer to the Jewish Holocaust with a capital H. We refer to the Armenian genocide as the first Holocaust of the 20th century. In my most recent book, my chapter on the Armenian genocide is called The First Holocaust. Indeed, Armenians in Jerusalem use the Hebrew word Shoah, Holocaust, for the 1915 genocide. Though I should add that I was appalled in Jerusalem a couple of months ago to see that Armenian posters containing photographs of the genocide have been defaced with Hebrew graffiti. But the historical, political links between the two provable acts of industrial genocide, that of the Ottoman Turks and that of the Nazis, are inextricably linked. When a German officer training the Turkish army in 1915, who was a witness to the genocide, turns up less than 30 years later as a Nazi officer murdering Jews in the occupied Soviet Union, that terrible narrative becomes complete. Why Israel should deny the genocide of 1915 remains a total mystery to me. Our own dear Tony Blair, the most mendacious Prime Minister Britain's ever had, and it's had quite a few, tried to stop the Armenians being present at the Holocaust Day memorial services in London. You would not want me to spend too much time on the cowardice of the West's political leaders. You know it for yourself. Presidents and prime ministers who would have to resign if they denied the Jewish Holocaust will go out of their way to avoid any reference to the Armenian Holocaust. Here we go. Bill Clinton, as we all know, promised Armenian Americans that he would refer to the genocide by name if he was elected president, and he became president, and he failed to call it a genocide. George W. Bush made the same promise, and he then broke it once he was elected. Let's recall exactly what Barack Obama said originally on the 19th of January, you know the date, 2008. I quote, "The Armenian genocide is not an allegation, a personal opinion, or a point of view, but rather a widely documented fact supported by an overwhelming body of historical evidence. The facts are undeniable. As a senator, I strongly support the passage of the Armenian Genocide Resolution, and as president, I will recognize the Armenian genocide." I was at the Cairo Reach Out speech to the Muslim world, by the way, and there were a lot of problems in that too. And of course, Obama followed in the miserable footsteps of his two cowardly predecessors and failed to keep his promise. Yesterday, we had the usual weasel words. The Armenians have been massacred. They have been marched to their death in the final days of the Ottoman Empire. Just who massacred the Armenians or who marched them to their deaths was not exactly stated, was it? Obama rightly praised the brave Turks who saved Armenians in 1915, but saved them from what? Obama might call the genocide a great calamity, as if it was an earthquake or an act of God, maybe a flood, a medziakelni, a great calamity, but that is not the word for genocide. It's not so much this cowardice to which I object. It's the cowardice which such denial encourages. Last night, some of you know this, I was interviewed about the genocide on CTV. Not my favourite channel, but there we go. But I was stunned to hear the genocide described on CTV as deadly massacres. This preposterous phrase was actually very revealing. The masters of CTV clearly know that the Armenian genocide, a word they would not use, of course, was on a massive scale. 1.5 million dead is a bit big for just a massacre. So, they went for a ridiculous tautology. It was not just a massacre, it was a deadly massacre. When is a massacre not deadly, ladies and gentlemen? Have you ever heard of an undeadly massacre? It's like talking about a lethal murder or a death-inducing homicide. See, so frightened are they of the word that they can't even write good English. But this also produces what I call slidey journalism, which often accompanies this form of genocidal denial. In yesterday's Toronto Globe and Mail, for example, Jeffrey Simpson, who's a nice guy, advanced an argument about the Armenian genocide, which, if used about the Jewish victims of the Nazis, would have pleased Adolf Hitler. Firstly, he put the word genocide in quotation marks, which is about as insulting as you can get. Then he advanced the following thesis. Multiculturalism, of which I know you're so fond, multiculturalism, he wrote, can be dangerous if diaspora politics twist Canada's foreign policy to suit ethnic demands. So why did he put genocide in single quotes? And then he goes on. He goes on to say, incredibly, the Armenian diaspora is particularly mobilized to press governments to denounce the events during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Note the word events, ladies and gentlemen. Even though what happened, note the words what happened, did not involve Canada and does not involve Canada today. Excuse me? Have I missed something here? I was under the impression that 500,000 Canadians fought in the First World War, and that almost 65,000 of these young Canadian men were killed fighting the German, Austrian-Hungarian, Ottoman alliance of enemies. The First World War, we should remember, was partly fought to destroy the Ottoman Empire. The Allies, including Canada, denounced the Armenian genocide during the war and demanded war crimes trials for the perpetrators. Some trials actually took place, as you know, after 1918, and several Ottoman officers were hanged for their war crimes. Canada itself demanded then help for the survivors of the Armenian genocide. Yet the Globe and Mail now tells us that Canada was not involved. The Halifax Herald, by the way, published a magnificent volume of its contemporary reports from 1915 of the genocide. But now we have to pretend it was never published. Let's imagine what would happen if the Globe and Mail decided to distance itself from the Jewish Holocaust, perhaps by putting Holocaust in inverted commas, or, if faced by German denial, washed its hands of the 6 million Jewish dead on the grounds that Canada was not involved. But it was involved, of course, at Dieppe and on D-Day and in the great Allied advance against Nazi Germany in 1944 and 1945, as surely as it was involved, with far greater casualties in the 1914-18 war, in which the Armenians suffered their genocide. So can you see what is happening? We are not only denying the Armenian genocide, to do so we are also rewriting history, which is what Obama did yesterday. Heaven knows, I ask myself, how can Obama, how is he going to handle World War III if he can't handle World War I? But let us move sideways, so to speak. Let's look at the Katyn massacre, the World War II slaughter by Stalin's NKVD secret police of 22,000 Polish officers near Smolensk, in what was then the Soviet Union. It was not a genocide by the Soviets. They were destroying their class enemies in the usual savage Soviet fashion. But it happened only 60 years ago, not 95 years, but 60 years ago. And although President Vladimir Putin of Russia does not accept Russian responsibility per se, and although the Soviet media prefer to talk of Katyn, quote, where thousands of Poles died, sounds like the Globe and Mail, the language of Turkish genocide denial, Putin has publicly accepted that the Polish massacres were the work of Stalin's murderous secret police. Putin wants the NKVD files further opened. Isn't that what many Armenians demand of the Turks? That they should admit the Ottoman Turks carried out the genocide and modern-day Turkey is not responsible